April 12, 1967. North Vietnamese camp near Hanoi. The humid air clung to the American prisoners, wrapping them in a blanket of discomfort and tension. Lieutenant James "Jim" Carver, a 23-year-old pilot shot down during a high-altitude bombing run over the Red River Delta, squinted against the harsh sunlight streaming through the bars of his small open-air cell. He and 35 fellow POWs had been captured in the early hours of the morning after their aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire, plunging into a river that marked the beginning of weeks of hardship they had not anticipated. For the first time, these men, trained to rely on advanced American technology, navigational instruments, and rapid response rescue protocols, faced an environment where none of those advantages mattered. Their survival depended on endurance, ingenuity, and the delicate balance of human diplomacy in the face of relentless scrutiny. The North Vietnamese guards, young men themselves, armed with steel rifles and cold efficiency, regarded the newcomers with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. American POWs were shocked by the stark contrast between the industrial might they had relied on in their homeland and the harsh scarcity surrounding them. The camps were rudimentary, constructed from bamboo and corrugated metal, with barely enough room for a cot or a mat. Food was sparse, irregular, and nutritionally insufficient, a calculated measure to weaken morale. Carver noticed the wide-eyed glances among his comrades as they attempted to decipher the hierarchy of camp rules, learning quickly that a misstep could mean weeks of solitary confinement. The initial days were a psychological battlefield. Sleep was fragmented by the constant drone of insects, the creaking of bamboo, and the occasional shouts of guards enforcing obedience. Every POW carried in their mind the vivid recollection of American air bases, sprawling tarmacs filled with P-51 Mustangs and B-52 Stratus Fortresses, hangars buzzing with mechanics, ordnance specialists, and engineers maintaining machines of precise engineering that could project power across oceans. Here, the difference was striking. There were no mechanized marvels, no assembly lines producing tons of high-grade weaponry. There were only the basics: mudfloors, bamboo fences, and the unyielding discipline of a captor nation that had nothing to fear from the technological advantage these men carried in memory alone. Corporal Robert Hayes, captured during a failed reconnaissance mission over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, recorded his first impressions in a clandestine journal. "We are ghosts here. No planes roaring overhead, no radios, no maps. Only the wind, the guards, and the knowledge that our country exists in a world that continues to run without our presence." Hayes's words captured the essence of the shock that hit every new POW. The realization that despite the United States' overwhelming industrial and technological superiority, it could not immediately alter the conditions of captivity. The machinery of war was impressive, unstoppable in the skies, but powerless against the rigid and patient mechanisms of human containment. The North Vietnamese, aware of the propaganda value of their prisoners, implemented a structured program designed to exploit this shock. Each POW was interrogated in precise sequences, first to understand their mission and role, then to evaluate their susceptibility to indoctrination. Psychological manipulation was subtle yet relentless. Guards forced prisoners to witness carefully staged indoctrination sessions, where re-educated former captives spoke about the superiority of the Vietnamese cause, the futility of American imperialism, and the inevitability of national liberation. For men like Carver and Hayes, these orchestrated displays struck at their sense of identity, creating cognitive friction between their understanding of reality and the narrative being imposed upon them. Yet, even amid shock, the prisoners' American ingenuity and discipline surfaced. Officers quickly established informal routines, covertly reinforcing the values and structures they had relied on before capture. Each morning, a roll call and discrete physical exercises maintained physical conditioning. Quietly, men taught each other navigational tricks, aviation theory, and survival techniques, ensuring that knowledge gained in flight schools and training bases was not lost to captivity. Lieutenant Carver held impromptu lectures on engine mechanics, drawing diagrams in the sand, explaining the operation of jet turbines to men who might never see a functioning aircraft again. Food scarcity became both a physical and psychological challenge. Meals typically consisted of a thin rice porridge, occasionally supplemented by small portions of vegetables or protein when available. POWs quickly learned to ration, sharing sparingly and consuming in shifts to conserve energy. Malnutrition threatened the weakest, leading to rapid deterioration in body weight, immune response, and mental clarity. Guards, recognizing the limits of direct control, often allowed prisoners to organize minor cooperative activities, such as cultivating small vegetable plots near the edges of the camp. These plots became symbols of both resistance and adaptation, a means of survival, yes, but also a psychological assertion that life could persist even under oppressive conditions. The contrast between their industrialized homeland and the environment of captivity extended beyond physical conditions. POWs had been accustomed to a society of redundancy and abundance. An aircraft could be replaced, a mission recalculated, fuel and ordnance shipped across thousands of miles with reliability guaranteed. In captivity, none of these comforts existed. Each day presented a fixed scarcity, forcing soldiers to confront a reality where American ingenuity could not directly mitigate suffering. Even minor injuries became serious threats. A sprained ankle or cut hand could escalate into infection as medical supplies were limited and treatment protocols improvised. The psychological toll was compounded by isolation. POWs were deliberately kept from contact with the outside world, with letters censored or delayed. Each communication with family was reduced to a sanitized, monitored exchange, reinforcing the sense of dislocation. Carver recounted an encounter with a fellow pilot, a young man named Daniels, who broke down after hearing the laughter of Vietnamese children playing beyond the camp's bamboo walls, a stark reminder of freedom and normalcy left behind. It was in these moments that the prisoners felt the full magnitude of their dislocation. The most advanced machines of war were useless here, powerless against the patient mechanisms of human containment. Over time, small victories became critical. POWs developed clandestine signaling systems, tapping codes on walls, using improvised methods to convey messages without alerting guards. Each successful message reinforced morale, proving that even under extreme deprivation, human coordination and ingenuity persisted. Officers organized clandestine educational sessions, teaching foreign languages, technical theory, and tactical analysis. These intellectual exercises served dual purposes, maintaining mental acuity and preserving a sense of identity that the captors could not completely erase. Despite these pressures, resilience among the POWs remained remarkable. Carver noted that informal hierarchies quickly emerged within the prisoner population based on experience, rank, and technical expertise. Senior officers and veteran aviators assumed mentorship roles, providing guidance to newly captured men. These informal structures allowed POWs to organize survival strategies collectively, maintain morale, and preserve a sense of dignity. Secret codes were developed for rationing food, maintaining exercise regimens, and sharing medical supplies. Even in the absence of industrial power, the ingenuity of human organization became a defining advantage. Perhaps most striking was the prisoners' awareness of the world beyond the camp. Each new arrival brought stories of bombing raids, air battles, and U.S. military operations. Despite their isolation, prisoners meticulously documented these accounts, cross-referencing them with memories and pre-capture knowledge to construct a mental map of ongoing operations. Lieutenant Carver spent hours each day reconstructing maps of airfields, supply lines, and enemy positions in his journal, a ritual that preserved both his professional skill set and his connection to the wider war effort. By the 6th month of captivity, the American POWs had begun to internalize the lessons imposed upon them while simultaneously resisting them intellectually. The shock that had accompanied initial capture evolved into a grudging comprehension. The industrial might they had relied upon could not operate without human agency, and in this context, the most advanced technology in the world was powerless. Even the B-52 Stratofortresses, capable of leveling entire cities, were irrelevant within the confines of a bamboo cell. Yet their training, discipline, and ingenuity remained fully intact, tools that could not be destroyed by physical deprivation or ideological pressure. April 1967 deepened. POW routines solidified, blending survival with subtle resistance. Lieutenant Carver and Corporal Hayes became central figures in an emergent underground network, coordinating signals, sharing food, and maintaining morale. They developed a strict rotation for patrol watch duties near the bamboo perimeter, observing guard movements without alerting captors. Every observation became intelligence: who was more lenient, which paths to avoid during unauthorized movements, and how supplies were distributed. Even the camp's physical environment became a tool of adaptation. POWs improvised shelters using bamboo strips, tattered cloth, and mud. Rainy season floods forced them to elevate sleeping areas, creating small mounds that became safer havens from standing water. In these improvised constructions, ingenuity was paramount. Carver drew lessons from survival manuals, repurposing techniques designed for jungle navigation, combining them with knowledge gained from pre-flight training. Small victories: keeping a sleeping area dry, constructing a bamboo partition for privacy, or finding a hidden spot for clandestine messages, provided psychological stability against the oppressive monotony of captivity. The North Vietnamese relied heavily on rotation strategies to prevent POWs from forming stable groups. New arrivals were separated, sometimes placed in solitary confinement for days, to disrupt cohesion. But prisoners anticipated these moves. Carver's group used memorized codes to maintain contact across cells. A series of knocks on walls or floorboards conveyed letters or numbers corresponding to messages. These systems became lifelines, allowing the POW network to share warnings, news, and morale-boosting notes. Interrogations intensified. Prisoners were isolated for hours, questioned about mission details, operational plans, and intelligence networks. The interrogators used combinations of isolation, threats, and staged displays of compliance by other captives. American POWs were forced to witness re-education sessions in which older captives, broken or convinced, extolled the virtues of Vietnamese nationalism and the futility of resistance. For many, including Carver, these sessions were deeply demoralizing at first. Yet officers quickly trained men to observe without emotional engagement, treating the displays as psychological exercises rather than moral arguments. Hayes recorded, "The more we watched them, the more we understood the mechanics of fear, and the more we could protect our minds against it." Food remained scarce. Meals consisted largely of watery rice porridge with minimal protein. Prisoners learned to eat slowly, conserving energy while avoiding visible weakness. Foraging opportunities were rare but exploited. Small vegetable patches were cultivated quietly, often hidden from guards' line of sight. Prisoners used discarded seeds from meals, improvised irrigation systems, and knowledge from previous deployments to maximize yield. These plots not only supplemented caloric intake, but became symbolic victories, asserting control over an environment designed to strip it away. Health management was critical. Malnutrition, minor injuries, and tropical illnesses were constant threats. Prisoners organized rudimentary medical care, using limited supplies and improvising remedies. Fever, dysentery, and skin infections were common, but collective care mitigated fatalities. Carver taught basic first aid drawn from military manuals, while others improvised antibiotics from available resources. Knowledge sharing reinforced both practical survival and group cohesion, establishing an informal medical hierarchy that became essential to sustaining morale and life expectancy. Letters from home were rare, censored and delayed. Prisoners often read and reread them, piecing together news from fragments. Each letter became a lifeline to normalcy, reminding them of the world outside. Prisoners also relied on rumor, piecing together updates on the war's progress through whispered conversations among new arrivals. These stories were cross-referenced with operational knowledge, allowing men to maintain a mental map of military developments, despite isolation. By mid-1967, POWs had established a covert educational program. Carver led sessions on aviation theory, aerodynamics, and mechanics. Hayes organized discussions on navigation and geography, reconstructing maps from memory. Lessons on survival, strategy, and tactics were interwoven. These exercises had dual purposes: maintaining cognitive sharpness and fostering morale. Men recognized that mental resilience was as critical as physical endurance. Knowledge became a form of resistance, asserting that their skills and training could not be destroyed by captivity. The camp command occasionally staged propaganda operations, attempting to force prisoners to participate in statements criticizing U.S. policies or praising the Viet Cong. Compliance was sometimes feigned to protect life, but prisoners covertly documented these instances, learning the captor's psychological methods. Observing these staged sessions allowed prisoners to anticipate interrogation tactics, strengthening collective resistance. Physical conditioning became a disciplined routine. Despite malnutrition, POWs engaged in calisthenics, stretching, and makeshift strength exercises. Maintaining fitness was essential for both survival and morale. Officers emphasized endurance training, instructing men to conserve energy while remaining capable of rapid response in emergencies. These routines were critical during monsoon floods and other environmental hazards. In late 1967, news arrived through a clandestine network that American bombing rates had intensified. POWs analyzed the potential consequences. Increased U.S. air activity meant higher risk for nearby villages and camps, but also potential disruptions to guard routines. Carver theorized ways these disruptions could create small advantages, such as gaps in surveillance that allowed for safe movement or communication. POWs were acutely aware that while technology could alter battles, their day-to-day survival depended on human ingenuity and discipline within the constraints of their environment. Winter of 1967-1968 introduced new challenges. Monsoon rains transitioned to cooler, drier conditions, exposing prisoners to cold nights without adequate clothing. POWs adapted using layered clothing, shared blankets, and collective huddling to conserve heat. Seasonal shifts highlighted the constant vulnerability of human biology absent industrial support, air conditioning, heating, or medical infrastructure. Prisoners learned to measure their strength, manage exposure, and rely on each other to survive environmental extremes.
Despite the pressures, POWs found ways to maintain morale through social rituals. Secret card games, storytelling, and mental exercises created microcosms of normal life. Celebrations of birthdays or unit anniversaries were quietly organized, reinforcing bonds and preserving identity. Music and recitation of songs were common, often disguised as conversation or whispered chants to avoid guard suspicion. These small acts became essential psychological tools, reinforcing human resilience when material conditions were hostile. Spring 1968 intensified the psychological strain. POWs faced interrogations that tested loyalty and endurance. Carver and Hayes observed captors' tactics closely. They noted patterns. Certain questions were repeated in cycles. Guards reacted predictably to hesitation, and emotional reactions could be exploited. Prisoners developed mental scripts, rehearsing answers that revealed nothing while appearing compliant. The strategy reduced emotional fatigue, preserving cognitive resources for long-term survival. During this period, small escapes and attempted breaks were discussed quietly, though execution was rare due to extreme risks. POWs analyzed guard routines, mapped terrain from memory, and prepared tools from available materials. Even failed attempts were educational, teaching others about patterns of surveillance, gaps in attention, and potential vulnerabilities. Carver emphasized that the act of planning was as valuable as execution. It maintained agency and combat-focused thinking, countering the passive submission that captors aimed to enforce. Nutrition remained critical. The rice porridge and occasional fish provided insufficient protein. POWs improvised supplementation using insects, small amphibians, and wild greens discovered in nearby underbrush. They learned to cook without metal utensils, using heat from small charcoal stoves or heated rocks to sterilize and soften food. These adaptations were vital, reducing disease susceptibility and maintaining energy for physical and mental challenges. Clandestine communications expanded. POWs developed more complex coding systems, using mental arithmetic, knock sequences, and subtle gestures. Messages were passed during work details or through hidden spaces between walls. These communications allowed coordinated responses, sharing intelligence on guard patterns or relaying news from new arrivals. Even simple information about troop movements or bombing schedules became strategic assets, enabling micro-level planning within the camp. In the summer of 1968, POWs faced increased health crises. Tropical diseases surged with rainfall, and weakened immune systems made men more susceptible. Carver initiated a hierarchy of medical care. Minor infections were treated with improvised remedies. Moderate cases received shared attention by multiple men, and critical cases were carefully monitored to prevent mortality. Knowledge of symptom progression became communal intelligence. Men used observation charts mentally, tracking fevers, rashes, and digestive irregularities to predict and mitigate crises. Psychological resilience became structured. POWs conducted regular mental drills, memory exercises, tactical scenario simulations, and navigational reconstructions. These sessions had multiple functions: keeping minds active, resisting indoctrination, and providing structured daily routines. Carver remarked that the mind, when idle, becomes the first casualty of captivity. Structured thinking became a survival tool, reinforcing discipline, camaraderie, and morale under prolonged stress. Cultural adaptation was subtle but constant. POWs learned basic Vietnamese words, not for indoctrination, but for operational advantage, understanding guard commands, recognizing warnings, and avoiding miscommunication. Some developed routines of mimicry, listening to tone and inflection to anticipate guard mood and reaction. These adaptations increased situational awareness and reduced unexpected punishments, proving that linguistic intelligence was as vital as physical survival. Winter 1968 brought new challenges. Food supplies fluctuated due to supply chain disruptions and increased inspection intensity by captors. POWs refined rationing protocols. Small portions were measured to maximize caloric intake while preventing severe malnutrition. Shared meals were carefully divided, ensuring the weakest prisoners survived. This fostered solidarity, reinforcing social cohesion under extreme scarcity. Intelligence gathering persisted. POWs covertly observed guard rotations, noting shift overlaps and breaks. These observations informed minor but significant actions: discrete movement between cells, timing of communication passes, and identification of potentially exploitable weaknesses in surveillance. Carver's group maintained mental maps of the camp, tracking both human and environmental variables, which became critical for planning contingencies even if full escape remained improbable. Propaganda exposure increased. POWs were forced to watch staged confessions and ideological lectures. While intended to demoralize, these sessions became data points. Prisoners compared scripted statements with prior knowledge, identifying inconsistencies and psychological manipulation techniques. Understanding captors' methods reduced the session's impact, allowing men to maintain moral and cognitive autonomy despite coercion. Sleep disruption was a chronic problem. Guards conducted random cell inspections, loud announcements, and enforced early wake-ups to fatigue prisoners. POWs developed staggered sleep schedules, short naps, and mental relaxation techniques to maintain alertness and cognitive function. They shared methods for inducing sleep despite physical discomfort, heat, insects, and noise, creating a communal knowledge base critical for endurance. By early 1969, POWs had refined survival skills into an almost institutionalized system. Roles were designated: observers, medical aides, ration managers, educators, and morale officers. Each position rotated periodically to distribute responsibility and prevent burnout. Carver noted that structure was as vital as food and water. It maintained identity and purpose. The monsoon season of 1969 tested these systems. Torrential rains flooded sleeping areas, destroyed vegetable plots, and increased disease transmission. POWs adapted quickly. Bedding was raised, drainage paths were created, and hygiene routines were adjusted. Resourcefulness became routine, with constant improvisation required to maintain minimal living standards. Even small innovations like waterproofed bedding or covered cooking areas represented significant improvements in survival odds. Education and skill retention remained central. Carver's group reconstructed technical knowledge from memory, aircraft schematics, navigation techniques, and emergency protocols. Hayes led discussions on leadership, ethics, and historical military campaigns. This intellectual engagement served multiple purposes: cognitive stimulation, moral reinforcement, and covert preparation for eventual reintegration into military service. Food shortages in mid-1969 became severe. POWs enhanced foraging tactics, using memory of local flora and fauna. They created simple traps for fish and small mammals, and experimented with fermentation to preserve food longer. This experimentation increased caloric intake marginally, but had a substantial impact on survival rates. Creativity in subsistence activities became a form of empowerment against the systemic deprivation imposed by captors. Psychological endurance tactics evolved. Men developed shared rituals, morning recitations, evening reflection periods, and subtle signaling of solidarity during roll calls. These practices fostered unity, reduced isolation, and countered the psychological manipulation efforts by guards. Even minor gestures, a nod, a whispered line, or synchronized tapping became symbols of resistance and community cohesion.
By late 1969, Carver's leadership was instrumental in sustaining camp structure. Officers rotated roles efficiently, reinforced education programs, and monitored health and morale. Hayes documented environmental observations, guard behavior, and prisoner responses. This systematic approach optimized survival under extreme constraints, demonstrating that disciplined organization, ingenuity, and communal resilience were decisive in enduring prolonged captivity. April 1965, North Vietnam. The humid air pressed against the faces of newly captured American pilots, their uniforms damped with sweat and fear. Lieutenant James Harper had flown countless sorties over Hanoi, escorting B-52 bombers and dodging SAMs, but nothing could have prepared him for the stark reality of being a prisoner of war. His eyes scanned the dimly lit bamboo cage, the bamboo poles slick from condensation, the dirt floor uneven and littered with the remnants of previous captives. He had expected brutality, yes, but the immediacy of confinement, the physical, mental, and psychological compression of space was something entirely different. The North Vietnamese guards stood at the perimeter, silent, but their presence was an omnipresent weight, a constant reminder that every breath, every blink could be scrutinized and judged. Harper had been shot down during a night mission near the Red River Delta. His aircraft had caught flak from a radar-guided missile, the explosion ripping through the fuselage, the sudden drop of altitude turning stomachs, and then silence. When he awoke, he was no longer in the cockpit of an F-105 Thunder Chief, but lying on a damp bamboo mat, chained at the wrists, his uniform torn, his body aching from impact. The first thought, shared by every American POW who would arrive over the next decade, was disbelief. Not shock at capture, many had anticipated this risk, but the sheer difference between expectations and reality. The POWs had been briefed on survival and evasion. They had imagined escape attempts, perhaps fleeting moments of confrontation, yet nothing in training could replicate the surreal, oppressive world of the North Vietnamese prison. The early days were the harshest.
guards enforced a strict regimen, punctuated with violence, yet also laced with subtler, almost theatrical forms of intimidation. Prisoners were instructed to maintain silence unless spoken to, the bamboo walls absorbing every whispered complaint. Food rations were minimal, a bowl of rice occasionally supplemented with small portions of greens or fish, often insufficient to sustain basic caloric needs for men accustomed to high-energy combat sorties. Water was rationed and sometimes contaminated, introducing the persistent threat of dysentery and dehydration. Harper quickly realized that survival required not only mental fortitude, but also an adaptation to circumstances that were, in every measurable way, designed to break the spirit. By the third week, Harper and his fellow prisoners began mapping the unspoken rules of captivity. Small acts of compliance, like presenting a bowed head when approached, or moving silently during inspections, could mitigate immediate physical punishment. Yet even these gestures carried profound psychological consequences, a slow erosion of the sense of self that every trained American pilot had relied upon. Despite this, camaraderie began to emerge. Men shared whispered stories of missions flown, of families left behind, of fears unspoken. In these hushed moments, the collective identity of the POW became a lifeline. It was not just survival. It was a means of preserving the fragments of humanity that their captors sought to strip away. Among the most insidious aspects of captivity was the manipulation of information and perception. North Vietnamese officers were skilled in psychological warfare, exploiting both the physical and emotional vulnerabilities of prisoners. Harper noted in a journal he kept mentally the patterns of interrogation, repetition, isolation, and carefully calibrated threats. The officers used the POW's own knowledge against them, probing for operational details, mission reports, or broader strategic information. Each question was accompanied by a subtle physical cue, a tightened fist, a shift in stance, the sudden absence of a friendly gesture. The POWs quickly learned that the absence of overt violence did not imply safety. The psychological pressure was constant, a slow, grinding weight that could alter perception over time. Harper's personal threshold for endurance was tested repeatedly. One night, after a failed escape attempt by another prisoner, the guards chained Harper to a low post, arms raised and suspended above his head. Pain radiated through his shoulders, muscles screaming with each passing second. The guards circled, shouting instructions in Vietnamese, their voices sharp, punctuated by the occasional slap or kick directed at other prisoners. Yet amidst the immediate suffering, Harper observed a subtle pattern in their behavior, a methodical, almost ritualistic enforcement of compliance rather than arbitrary cruelty. The objective was not mere punishment, but extraction of cooperation. Psychological capitulation that could be observed, measured, and exploited. Harper understood that resistance required strategic patience, a mental calculation of which battles could be fought and which must be endured.
Communication among prisoners was an essential survival tool. Initially, all attempts were rudimentary. Taps on the bamboo, subtle foot movements, whispered code words. Over time, these evolved into a sophisticated network, conveying information about guard rotations, food distribution, health conditions, and morale. Harper contributed to the system, developing a series of rhythmic knocks that could convey complex messages over distance without detection. Through these signals, the POWs maintained cohesion, fostering resilience against both physical and psychological attrition. It became clear that the survival of one man was contingent on the survival of all, a principle that echoed the discipline and teamwork ingrained in American combat units. By mid-1966, the North Vietnamese had refined their techniques, creating what Harper and others would later describe as a systematic deconstruction of the American soldier. Prisoners were rotated between camps, subjected to alternating periods of isolation and collective containment, and forced into labor that tested both endurance and obedience. These tasks, digging trenches, carrying heavy supplies, or performing menial maintenance, were designed to emphasize the disparity between the prisoner's expectations and the harsh reality of captivity. Yet, paradoxically, these routines also offered moments of quiet reflection. Harper noted in his journal that even the physical exhaustion induced a strange clarity. Each movement became deliberate, each breath a conscious decision to endure. Nutrition, or the lack thereof, played a central role in the captivity experience. The standard rations, often consisting of 300 to 400 grams of rice per day, failed to meet the caloric requirements of men accustomed to high-intensity operations. Protein deficiency manifested rapidly. Harper observed fellow prisoners experiencing hair loss, weakened muscles, and persistent fatigue. Medical care was minimal, often limited to rudimentary bandaging or herbal remedies provided reluctantly by the guards. Disease spread easily in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, malaria, and respiratory infections were common, exacerbated by the tropical climate. The POWs responded by developing informal systems of healthcare, pooling knowledge from field manuals, personal experience, and shared observations. Small innovations, improvised splints, shared herbal teas, and careful rationing of limited medical supplies became critical for survival. Psychological adaptation became equally vital. Harper and his peers employed techniques to maintain cognitive function and morale. Mental exercises, rehearsing flight missions, calculating fuel loads, recounting technical specifications, help preserve a sense of purpose and identity. Stories of family, childhood, and past victories provided mental refuge. The POWs created informal hierarchies, assigning roles based on skills and experience. Intelligence gathering, health monitoring, morale enforcement, and communication coordination. These roles were not just practical, they reinforced social structure, preventing the complete psychological collapse that the captors sought to induce. The North Vietnamese also exploited environmental and sensory deprivation. Cells were often dark, with minimal ventilation, and prisoners were subjected to irregular light cycles designed to disrupt circadian rhythms. Sleep became a precious commodity, frequently interrupted by inspection or punishment. Temperature extremes, from the oppressive heat of summer to the damp cold of monsoon season, added further strain. Harper learned to manage these conditions through careful layering of clothing, conservation of movement, and mental visualization of more comfortable settings. These adaptive strategies were essential, as the body and mind weakened under the constant stress of captivity. The interactions between prisoners and guards were a continuous study in negotiation and restraint. Harper quickly observed patterns in the guards' behavior, noting moments of apparent leniency followed by sudden enforcement of rules. Small concessions, extra food, brief moments of sunlight, permission to wash, were contingent on compliance, serving as both reward and leverage. The POWs became adept at reading cues, shifts in guard stance, changes in tone, micro-expressions. Each observation informed their decisions, allowing them to minimize unnecessary conflict while preserving dignity. The dynamic was subtle, yet crucial, a psychological chess game played over months and years. Letters and messages from home were rare but transformative. Harper received one letter in early 1967, smuggled through Red Cross intermediaries, containing only a single line: "We wait for your return." The brevity belied its impact. For Harper, this tiny fragment of connection to the outside world reinforced resilience, a reminder that he existed beyond the bamboo walls. POWs collectively emphasized the importance of hope, recognizing it as a form of psychological sustenance equivalent to food or water. Discussions among prisoners often returned to this theme: the importance of envisioning liberation, of mentally rehearsing freedom, and of sustaining belief in eventual reunion with family and comrades. By late 1967, the North Vietnamese had escalated both the physical and psychological pressures. The Hanoi Hilton, as the American POWs would later call Hualo Prison, had become a site of methodical torture, designed to extract intelligence and break morale. Harper endured repeated interrogations, including beatings, prolonged stress positions, and threats of execution. Yet he and his fellow prisoners developed a collective resilience that transcended individual suffering. They adhered to a code of conduct developed in conjunction with military doctrine: resist, survive, and maintain loyalty. Even in moments of extreme duress, Harper found that the unspoken network of support among prisoners, shared glances, coded taps, and whispered encouragement, provided a psychological buffer against capitulation. Early 1968. Hanoi Prison, Hanoi. The prisoners had settled into a grim rhythm. Days blurred together, punctuated by the ritual of roll call, the distribution of meager rations, and the endless cycle of guards' inspections. Lieutenant Harper had been moved to a new cell with several other Americans, pilots, navigators, and a few intelligence officers. Each man carried the scars of both physical abuse and mental strain, and their interactions were governed by unspoken rules: mutual respect, shared responsibility, and strict codes of communication. Harper observed that the North Vietnamese had refined their approach to breaking prisoners. They alternated between overt violence and psychological manipulation, introducing periods of relative calm followed by sudden punishment. One morning, after a week of uninterrupted rest, Harper and his cellmates were summoned for interrogation. The guards demanded detailed accounts of bombing missions over Hanoi and strategic evaluations of American air operations. The questions were precise, yet framed in a manner designed to provoke frustration and fatigue. When Harper refused to comply, he was left standing in the sun for hours, hands chained behind his back, exposed to the oppressive tropical heat. The lesson was clear. Defiance could be endured, but it came at a cost. The prisoners developed coping strategies. They established a routine of mental exercises, memorization of technical manuals, and covert communication systems. Taps on bamboo walls, subtle foot movements, and synchronized coughs became a language through which they shared vital information. Harper and the others realized that maintaining cognitive function was as crucial as preserving physical health. Isolation, hunger, and continuous monitoring were weapons aimed at eroding mental resilience, and the prisoners fought back with ingenuity. They rehearsed flight missions, performed mental calculations, and recited literature, creating a shared mental space that could not be penetrated by their captors. Nutrition remained a persistent struggle. Rations were calorically insufficient and nutritionally poor, consisting mainly of rice and small portions of vegetables or fish. Protein deficiency led to muscle wasting and chronic fatigue. Malaria, dysentery, and respiratory infections were common, exacerbated by poor sanitation and humid conditions. Harper and the other prisoners improvised treatments, sharing knowledge of herbal remedies, limited medical supplies, and methods for mitigating infection. Every meal became a calculation of survival: stretch resources, avoid illness, and preserve strength for labor and evasion of interrogation. Labor was another tool for control. Prisoners were forced to dig trenches, carry heavy supplies, and perform maintenance tasks under the watchful eyes of guards. The work was exhausting, designed to break resistance and instill dependence. Yet Harper and his peers discovered subtle ways to resist without triggering punishment: pacing themselves, sharing burdens, and discreetly exchanging messages about guard routines. The physical exertion, while punishing, also provided structure and a sense of agency, small victories in an environment engineered to strip autonomy. Social dynamics among prisoners evolved into a critical component of survival. Harper observed that morale was directly tied to the strength of interpersonal networks. Men assumed roles based on expertise and temperament. Leaders organized communication. Medical officers treated illness,
and morale officers maintained spirits through humor, storytelling, and reminders of home. These informal hierarchies stabilized the group, providing structure and reinforcing the principle that individual survival was intertwined with collective resilience. Even small acts, like passing extra rations or sharing information about guard behavior, had outsized effects on morale and endurance. Psychological warfare intensified. Guards exploited sensory deprivation, alternating light and darkness, manipulating sleep cycles, and restricting movement to induce disorientation. Harper adapted by developing mental routines, visualizing flight operations, memorizing mission details, and rehearsing conversations with family. The POWs also created private rituals, singing hymns quietly, or performing imaginary drills to assert control over their own mental states. Harper noted that resilience was as much about maintaining identity as physical survival. Every remembered fact, every mental rehearsal, was a defiance of the captor's objective to erase individuality. By mid-1968, the prisoners had perfected covert communication. Taps, scratches, coughs, and foot thuds formed a complex code that allowed for real-time coordination across cells. Harper contributed by standardizing rhythms that represented letters, numbers, and operational signals. These systems allowed them to share critical intelligence, changes in guard shifts, food allocation patterns, and upcoming interrogations. The development of these communication networks was a turning point. Prisoners could act as a coordinated group, increasing their capacity for endurance and resistance. Even small victories, like passing a coded message undetected, offered psychological reinforcement, affirming that the captors were not omnipotent.
The interrogations became increasingly brutal as the North Vietnamese sought to extract operational intelligence. Harper endured repeated stress positions, prolonged isolation, and physical beatings. Yet he and his peers adhered to a strict code of conduct: resist without surrendering mental autonomy. The shared knowledge of this code, reinforced through their covert networks, created a form of solidarity that was as effective as any physical defense. They drew strength from the principle that cooperation with captors was permissible only to the extent necessary for survival, and that ultimate loyalty remained with the United States. Letters from home were sporadic but profoundly impactful. Even brief messages reinforced hope and served as tangible reminders of the world beyond captivity. Harper recalled receiving a single card in 1969, the message succinct: "Hold on, we are waiting." Such messages became rituals of morale. Prisoners would read and reread them, memorize every word, and share the sentiment among the group. These small connections to family and country were crucial in sustaining resilience. They also reinforced the internal code. Survival was not an individual goal, but a duty to return and bear witness. Medical conditions remained dire. Malnutrition, disease, and untreated injuries compounded over time. Harper and his peers improvised care systems, using available resources to treat wounds, prevent infection, and manage chronic conditions. They observed the body's responses, documented patterns mentally, and shared knowledge with fellow prisoners. Each successful intervention reinforced cohesion and morale, creating a system of mutual dependence that enhanced the collective capacity to endure. Survival became both a physical and intellectual exercise. Observation, improvisation, and shared expertise were as vital as any rationed meal. The prisoners' sense of time became distorted. Days blended into nights, weeks into months. Harper developed mental routines to anchor himself, recounting flight operations, performing mathematical calculations, and reciting literature. These exercises were not mere distractions. They reinforced cognitive resilience, maintained technical knowledge, and preserved identity. By structuring time internally, prisoners resisted the North Vietnamese strategy of disorientation. Harper realized that mental discipline was the most sustainable form of resistance. The body could be weakened, but the mind remained a domain of autonomy. By 2010, the cumulative strain had produced both adaptation and innovation among POWs. Harper observed that subtle forms of resistance, covert communication, ritualized routines, and strategic compliance were increasingly effective. Prisoners coordinated small acts of defiance, sharing food discreetly, signaling locations of hidden resources, and maintaining collective morale. Even in the face of extreme deprivation, these acts reinforced agency. The North Vietnamese, skilled in physical and psychological coercion, could not entirely suppress ingenuity and cooperation among a determined group of trained soldiers. Escape attempts, though rare, were meticulously planned. Harper participated in a small initiative to map guard routines, identify structural weaknesses, and test limits of confinement. Each attempt, even if unsuccessful, provided valuable intelligence and reinforced group cohesion. Failures were instructive, emphasizing the importance of patience, observation, and strategic calculation. The prisoners' focus shifted from immediate freedom to long-term endurance. Survival, preservation of intelligence, and maintenance of morale became paramount. Every action was measured against the likelihood of sustained life, collective solidarity, and ultimate return. By late 1971, the prisoners had transformed the experience of captivity into a study of human resilience. The North Vietnamese methods of control, physical deprivation, psychological manipulation, and social isolation remained formidable. Yet the prisoners had developed countermeasures that mitigated the worst effects. Covert communication, collective responsibility, mental exercises, and ritualized routines provided psychological armor. Every meal, every interaction, every observation became an opportunity to assert autonomy, preserve identity, and sustain hope. Harper concluded that survival was as much a function of intellect and social cohesion as physical endurance. Early 1972. Hanoi remained tense. The Vietnam War had shifted into its final phases, and prisoners like Harper were acutely aware of the changing political landscape. The North Vietnamese, aware of negotiations and international scrutiny, alternated their treatment between punitive measures and calculated displays of relative leniency. Harper and the other POWs recognized this as strategic manipulation designed to fracture morale and extract cooperation. They responded with disciplined patience, reinforcing the internal code of conduct that had been their lifeline for years: resist beyond physical endurance, preserve mental autonomy, and maintain collective solidarity. By now, Harper had spent nearly 5 years in captivity. The weight of time was relentless, yet adaptation had honed extraordinary capabilities. He could detect subtle shifts in guard behavior, anticipate interrogation strategies, and coordinate with other prisoners through complex coded signals. Sleep deprivation, disease, and malnutrition had eroded the body, but mental acuity remained sharp through deliberate exercises, memorization of operational manuals, recitation of literature, and rehearsal of flight procedures. Every cognitive effort reinforced identity and asserted defiance against the systematic dehumanization of imprisonment. Nutrition, though still scarce, became a site of strategic planning. Prisoners learned to divide portions efficiently, conceal small amounts for future use, and supplement their diet with scavenged vegetation when possible. Harper became adept at maximizing caloric intake while minimizing waste, understanding that survival required both physical conservation and careful observation of resources. Even small victories, like identifying a hidden food cache or successfully trading portions without detection, had an outsized impact on morale and cohesion. Social dynamics reached a sophisticated equilibrium. Harper and other senior prisoners assumed leadership roles,
organizing covert meetings, establishing hierarchies of responsibility, and mentoring new arrivals in survival techniques. They formalized methods of communication across cells. Tapping rhythms, discrete cough sequences, and coded scratches on walls conveyed operational intelligence, morale updates, and instructions for daily routines. This system, born from necessity, evolved into a reliable network that allowed prisoners to coordinate responses to interrogations, ration distribution, and labor assignments.
Physical labor continued to be a tool of control. Prisoners were forced to perform grueling tasks, digging, hauling, constructing, designed to sap energy and instill dependency. Harper observed that strategic pacing, cooperative burden sharing, and subtle defiance allowed prisoners to retain strength and maintain autonomy. Each calculated act of resistance, whether a delayed motion or covert adjustment, provided a psychological edge and reinforced a sense of control in an environment engineered for total domination. Medical conditions worsened with time. Chronic infections, untreated injuries, and malnutrition were constant threats. Harper and fellow prisoners improvised treatments using limited medical knowledge and available resources. They monitored symptoms, shared observations, and implemented preventative measures. This informal medical network saved lives, mitigated the progression of disease, and reinforced interdependence. The act of caring for one another became both a practical necessity and a psychological anchor, strengthening the social bonds that underpinned endurance. Interrogations persisted but had become predictable. Harper noted that the North Vietnamese employed a combination of coercion and subtle psychological manipulation, alternating harsh questioning with periods of comparative calm, feigning empathy to extract information, and leveraging isolation to induce disorientation. Harper's response was systematic. He relied on rehearsed mental routines, controlled responses, and shared strategies among prisoners. Every interaction became an exercise in resilience, maintaining composure, preserving mental clarity, and denying the captors the psychological victories they sought. Letters and external news became increasingly rare, yet their impact remained profound. A brief report of progress in peace talks or a simple note from home reinforced hope and provided context to an otherwise opaque existence. Harper recalled receiving a single note from home that read, "We are counting the days. Stay strong." These fragments of the outside world became objects of ritualized attention, read and reread, memorized and shared with peers to reinforce collective morale. The significance lay not in the quantity of communication, but in its affirmation of connection, purpose, and eventual liberation. By mid-1972, prisoners had refined covert communication to a remarkable degree. Tapping sequences were standardized to convey letters, numbers, and operational signals. Foot thuds, coughs, and wall scratches allowed coordination across multiple cells. Harper contributed to optimizing these codes, ensuring clarity and efficiency. These networks enabled prisoners to share intelligence, alert one another to upcoming interrogations, and distribute morale updates. Even under extreme surveillance, the system provided a sense of agency and reinforced the principle that autonomy could not be entirely suppressed. The social fabric among prisoners was further reinforced by informal education systems. Harper and others conducted lessons on military tactics, navigation, and technical skills as a means of preserving knowledge and as a psychological exercise. These sessions fostered engagement, reinforced cognitive function, and created a sense of purpose. Storytelling,
Shared memories and humor were integrated, transforming otherwise oppressive hours into structured activity. Such organization preserved morale, reinforced hierarchy, and strengthened group cohesion, which was critical for enduring both physical hardship and psychological manipulation.
Medical improvisation evolved into quasi-scientific observation. Harper and his peers documented patterns of illness, observed responses to limited treatments, and coordinated care strategies. Even when equipment and medicines were scarce, understanding symptoms and preventative measures mitigated risks. These practices enhanced survival rates and reinforced interdependence. Each successful intervention validated knowledge, strengthened morale, and emphasized the principle that survival was a collaborative effort, dependent not solely on individual fortitude, but on shared expertise and coordinated action. By late 1972, the prisoners had adapted to an environment initially designed to eliminate individuality. Harper noted a profound psychological shift. Captivity, while harsh, became a crucible for human endurance. The principles that once applied to flight missions, observation, planning, coordination, were now essential for survival. Social cohesion, cognitive exercises, and disciplined routines countered the captors' objectives. Harper concluded that resistance was multifaceted: mental, social, and physical, each reinforcing the others to sustain life and identity. The approach to potential escape had also matured. Harper and other senior prisoners conducted careful surveillance of guards, studied structural weaknesses, and planned contingencies. Attempts were rare, calculated, and executed only when the probability of survival justified the risk. Even unsuccessful efforts provided critical intelligence, strengthened group cohesion, and demonstrated agency. Prisoners internalized the principle that freedom was both a long-term objective and a conceptual anchor, motivating resilience while avoiding reckless endangerment. The political climate in 1973 accelerated the process of repatriation. Harper and his peers were increasingly aware of negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam. The captors' tactics shifted once more. Periods of harsh treatment were interspersed with subtle leniency, aimed at extracting symbolic cooperation. Harper maintained disciplined skepticism. Hope was balanced with strategy. Survival and the preservation of operational knowledge remained paramount. Prisoners focused on internal systems, communication, routines, morale, to maintain readiness for eventual release. The months leading to repatriation were a mixture of tension, anticipation, and continued adaptation. Harper observed that the North Vietnamese sought to test endurance and extract final concessions. He and other prisoners reinforced routines, optimize resource distribution, and rehearse coordinated responses. Communication networks were fully operational, morale strategies institutionalized, and cognitive exercises rigorously maintained. The group had evolved into a cohesive unit capable of withstanding both physical deprivation and psychological manipulation. Finally, in early 1973, the announcement of release came. Harper and the other POWs were moved through increasingly lenient conditions, monitored but no longer subjected to the extremes of earlier captivity. The journey to repatriation was both physical and psychological. The body had endured years of malnutrition and labor, the mind years of sustained mental exertion, and the spirit years of uncertainty. Yet the systems established, covert communication, mutual support, mental discipline, ensured that survival was not merely possible but probable. Upon return, Harper observed a world both familiar and alien. His body was weak, yet his mind remained sharp. His social instincts had adapted to a system of extreme interdependence. The lessons of captivity, resilience, strategy, mental discipline, and collective responsibility remained indelible. These principles, forged under duress, would shape not only reintegration but his entire post-war life. Harper's experience was emblematic of the broader phenomenon faced by American POWs. Endurance was not simply a function of physical strength, but the product of disciplined cognition, coordinated social strategies, and the assertion of identity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The story of survival was not a tale of individual heroism, but of collective ingenuity, structured defiance, and the capacity to adapt under extreme conditions. The lessons of Hualo prison resonate far beyond the historical moment. Harper's account illustrates that human resilience is not innate, but cultivated. It requires structure, discipline, social cohesion, mental exercise, and strategic patience. Captivity, while extreme, becomes a laboratory for understanding the limits of endurance and the mechanisms by which autonomy, identity, and purpose can be preserved even in the harshest conditions. In the end, Harper's liberation was not just a physical removal from confinement, but the culmination of years of methodical preparation, disciplined resistance, and the maintenance of hope through structured effort. Every coded message, every mental rehearsal, every act of collective support contributed to survival. The story of American POWs like Harper is a testament to the capacity for strategic endurance, the power of organized social systems, and the indomitable potential of human cognition under pressure.